Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that the Mississaugas of the Credit are covered by the Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaty signed by multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University and the co-sponsors for today's panel, the Edmonton Public Library, the Milton Public Library, the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library, I want to welcome you to our panel entitled Broadband Access, How Can It Be Made a Reality for All? Internet access has become essential, yet many in Canada and around the world have no access for a variety of reasons, which our expert panel will discuss today, along with the resulting inequality and often devastating consequences for people who don't have effective access. The panel will also explore available solutions. I'd like to introduce our panel. The first panelist is Paulo Cardullo. Paulo is a senior postdoctoral researcher at IN3, Universitat Oberta de Catalunya in Barcelona. His most recent... I'm sorry?
Many thanks for inviting me.
My pleasure. Paulo's most recent book is Citizens in the Smart City, Participation, Co-Production, Governance, published this year by Routledge. Paulo previously was a postdoc at Maynooth University School of Business, working as part of the Technology Adoption Group, and the Programmable City Project at the university's National Institute for Regional and Spatial Analysis. Paulo has also taught at Goldsmiths, the University of London, and at the University of Antwerp. Welcome, Paulo.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. In Italian time, of course.
Yes.
I'm in Italy at the moment.
This is our afternoon, and for the people on the West Coast, noontime or morning, and your evening. So thank you. Our second panelist is Ray Noyes. Ray is a member and a leader in ACORN Canada, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, which is an international collection of autonomous, community-based organizations that advocate for low and moderate income families by working on neighborhood safety, voter registration, healthcare, affordable housing, and other social issues. Ray was born in Nova Scotia and currently lives in Vanier, which is part of Ottawa. He earned a degree in theology at St. Paul's University. Some years later, as a result of some difficult challenges, he landed on long-term disability, which continued until he became 65. In 2012, he first got involved with ACORN. As Ray describes it, after a seriously bad time in 2018, he was coaxed back to ACORN work by Ashley Rains from ACORN's Ottawa office. Since then, Ray has been speaking about the problems of the unaffordability of internet access he and many others in Canada's South experience, often many in major urban areas, a serious problem that has been made much more visible during this pandemic. Welcome, Ray.
Thanks very much, Jim.
Our third panelist is Sofia Ranchardos. She's a full professor of European and Comparative Public Law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Sofia conducts research on public law and digital technology from an interdisciplinary perspective. She has more than 10 years of experience in the field of regulation and governance, including e-commerce and digital platforms. Her research interests include the study of data-driven regulation, the impact of big tech on fundamental rights and good administration, as well as new approaches to better regulation, experimental legislation, and innovation policy. Sofia held previous academic positions at the Information Society Project at Yale Law School, at Tilburg University, and at Leiden University. Welcome, Sofia.
For having me.
Our last panelist is Madeline Redfearn. Madeline was born in Iqaluit, Nunavut, and is a former mayor of Iqaluit. She is a graduate of a Kitsarak Law School with a law degree from the University of Victoria. After graduating, Madeline worked at the Supreme Court of Canada for Madam Justice Sharon. Madeline is a member of the National Indigenous Economic Development Consortium, Arctic 360, Trudeau Foundation, president of Ajunji Group, Sedna Link Marine Systems, and chief operating officer of CanArctic Inuit Networks. In her 30 years of experience in business and governance, Madeline has worked on issues related to economic development, housing, education, employment and training, justice, community services, early childhood development, and healthcare. Welcome, Madeline.
Thank you.
And the moderator for this fine panel is Alexandra Flynn. Alex is an assistant professor at the Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia. Her teaching and research focus on municipal law and governance, administrative law, property law, and experiential education. Alex grew up in Iqaluit, Nunavut, and has more than 10 years of experience practicing Aboriginal law and working in a senior municipal government role. Her work has included representation of First Nations in the economic development of reserve lands, the drafting of land management agreements, and consultation and accommodation involving numerous governmental and corporate parties. She recently began a SSHRC-funded project which seeks to understand the legal relationship between First Nations and municipal governments. The goal of the project is to illuminate the legal obligations of municipal governments, including the duty to consult and accommodate, to create reciprocal, respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples and First Nations. Alex is a past TEDx speaker and a frequent media commentator. She has a long history of volunteer work in the areas of homelessness and access to justice. Welcome, Alex.
Hi there. Great to be here.
Thank you. We're glad you're here. The format for today's event is that the panel with Alex will carry on a conversation for about 45 to 55 minutes, after which there'll be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions, so to bring the audience into the conversation. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, and that's what you should use. The chat function in this version of Zoom is disconnected, but the Q&A button is where you can write out a question at any time during the conversation. So if you hear something that's said you'd like to ask about, go to click on the Q&A button and simply write out your question as you think of it. You don't have to wait till Alex turns to the audience for commentary. So we look forward to this discussion. Over to you, panel.
Terrific. Well, it's an absolute thrill to be able to moderate this session with what I call a complete superstar panel. It's such an important issue. A couple of interesting things happened in the last couple of days, one of which was an internet outage across much of Canada, which gave many of us just a glimpse of what it's like to not have reliable broadband and not have internet access. And the other was the tabling of a federal budget, which is committing additional funds to broadband access in the North. So it's very timely to be having this discussion and to unpack what this all means for not just Canadians, but as a human right for everybody across the world. And I honestly cannot think of a better panel to be illuminating these important issues. I want to just acknowledge a couple of things before we start. One is for everybody just to take note of where you are and who's around you. Land acknowledgements are increasingly common in Canada and in the United States across Turtle Island. But I think there's a deeper message that we can all get from it, from doing it, which is to really acknowledge where we are and who is amongst us. The pandemic has made us smaller in some ways. It's condensed our lives. And I think to really understand what the impact of something like unequal broadband is requires taking a broader lens of where we are and the inequities that are around us. I personally am extremely fortunate to be joining you from Coast Salish territories, the unceded ancestral lands of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh people, which is also known as Vancouver. And so I hope that for those of you who are able, you can take note of the Indigenous lands that you're on. You can go to native-land.ca if you're not familiar with the territories that you're on, and you can see the overlapping nations to which you are privileged to be on as well. The other thing that I want to acknowledge is those who are not able to join. We're lucky that the Center for Free Expression will be maintaining this video hopefully in perpetuity for the many different people who will be able to see it afterwards. I know for myself in my classes and just for my own understanding, I go back to these videos that I'm not able to join and see what people had to say. But there's many people who just simply cannot join: the urban poor, those with unreliable access, frontline workers, very much the people that are at the heart of the discussion that we're having today. So I just want to acknowledge all of them who are not able to join at the times that we are to have this engaged discussion with us. So I'm going to start with a question for each participant. And I want to just note a couple of preliminary things. One is that there is a definition for broadband, which will come out in our discussion. But in the Q&A, if that's something that you want to know more about, just let us know, because we have lots of nerds on the panel who can tell you about the nitty-gritty of what broadband means and what it means to have high-speed internet. We will be talking about some of the technicalities of that. And so feel free to weigh in with questions if that needs to be clarified. And the other thing to note is that, we have a mixed panel. We have people here in Canada, and we have people who are coming from, international jurisdictions. And that's really intentional. We need to know what's happening here, the only G7 country that doesn't have a national broadband plan. But we also know that there's many countries that do it way better than we do. And so that's really at the heart that we're trying to get at. What are the problems here, like the nitty-gritty problems that we're facing, and what can we learn from other jurisdictions in addressing them? So I'm going to start off with a question for each participant. And I'm going to start with former Iqaluit Mayor Madeline Redfearn, and really somebody who has been at the heart of addressing broadband inequity in Nunavut for many, many, many years, if not decade or longer. Madeline, I thought you could just start this conversation by telling us some of the realities that exist in Nunavut for people who don't have access to high-speed internet. What does that look like?
Thank you, Alexandra. So I'm here in Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut, which is situated on South Baffin, which is an island next to Greenland. So we are 100% satellite dependent in our territory of 25 communities, as are a number of other communities in the north. And what that means is that our internet is not always reliable. It can go down or degrade when there's weather issues. It is unstable. At times, you just simply cannot connect, or you can't get money from your bank account, or you can't pay for your groceries or your gas when you're out. And that it is often low speed, so it can drop. A lot of applications require a timely or quick connection. Otherwise, you find yourself, filling in something online. It could be an online purchase or something with the Government of Canada website, and you lose everything that you've inputted, and then you have to restart. And that therefore it's not surprisingly, it can be slow. There are times where you just, you can't download an email or send an email, which can greatly affect our ability to do things like, meet online deadlines. We just take it for granted that, you're going to be able to send something, because of the internet. And so you have to plan in advance for that, if it's not going to work. And lastly, because it's satellite, it's extremely expensive. So we pay, probably some of the highest internet or connectivity prices across the country for the worst service. And it makes it really, really hard. We're definitely seeing the digital divide grow. as there's significant advances in southern and urban Canada.
Thank you very much. And I will get more into the impacts of that, I think, on things like health and education throughout our discussion. But thank you very much for illustrating that for us. Ray, you're coming at this issue from a different perspective. You live in an urban area, but of course we know that even though close to 100% of higher income households have access to reliable internet, it's less than 70% for low income households. I know you didn't have access to the internet at the start of the pandemic, at this crucial period where everything shut down and people were in their homes. What was it like?
Well, first, Alexandra, I'd like to follow your lead and do as we do in ACORN meetings, which is a land acknowledgement. Where I'm located is unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe land. But to answer your question, when the pandemic began, I was an 8-year ACORN member who was sometimes called upon to do media interviews. And when I was asked what it was like to have no internet during the pandemic, I would start by saying that as a disabled person living on minimal provincial benefits, I found that the pandemic exacerbated my mental health issue. I was reliant on radio and 3 TV channels for news, and I was constantly hearing about how important the internet was to stay connected, to get information, and to avoid mentally harmful isolation, all of which were problems for me. And much more so with the pandemic because mobility and other things were all shut down. My doctor and my counselor visits were by phone, as were my ACORN Zoom meetings. On April 6th, I saw my doctor for the first time in a year through a limited data tablet provided by her community health center. Without it, attending this event that I'm attending right now and others like it would be impossible. ACORN is a member-driven, community-based organization with 140,000 members across Canada, and it has been fighting for affordable internet for low-income people since 2013. So far, our best outcome was the Connecting Families program of 2018, which proved that the federal government could do something on this issue if it had the will. This offered $10 per month internet for eligible families, but it had many drawbacks, and I might get to touch on those later. In 2016, ACORN members both locally and across the country testified about this issue before the CRTC, which for our European friends is Canada's telecommunications regulator. The commissioners said they were very moved by what they heard, but little has come of it. Recently, as you probably know, Prime Minister Trudeau has repeatedly said that all Canadians should have broadband internet, but he has not seemed to recognize the cost barrier. Now, I know with Madeleine, there are other barriers as well. I realize that. But for people like me, it's the cost barrier. Frustrated with the federal response, we've turned to the possibility of low-cost, municipally run internet services. There's been some success with this in Toronto. Toronto City Council has approved municipally run internet. But in our canvassing, we've also found great support for the notion that the internet is a basic, essential need in today's society. ACORN continues to fight on this issue, on this very basis, for free expression, for social participation. Affordable internet has become more than a need. It is an essential human right.
And we'll get more into that as we talk about what we can do about it, or what should happen and what's happened elsewhere. But thank you for clarifying for us what it was like for you not being able to access the internet, especially being homebound. Sofia, I'd love, I mean, you are so experienced in writing on digital exclusion and what it means, really unpacking what it means in a larger sense. I'm wondering if you can tell us more about the range of experiences that people face in regard to digital exclusion.
Well, thank you so much for having me for this great question. So far we have been talking about digital exclusion in the sense of not having access to broadband, not having access to stable, high-speed internet because of its affordability, because of geographical factors. This is just one of the many layers of digital exclusion. There are countries where internet is more affordable, where the infrastructure is there, and still many citizens, millions of citizens, are excluded because beyond the level of infrastructure and affordability, we have other levels. So we actually need to ensure that the population has the skills, has social economic conditions in general, but they also have the willingness to actually welcome technology. And very often what you see is that in certain countries where governments have already taken care of the part of it, they haven't taken care of the whole picture, right? So basically digital exclusion then occurs because you actually have created the possibility to give access to the internet, but you have not thought of digital literacy, you have not thought of just digital skills in general, or you basically have forgotten the fact that for many people, just interacting with technology, with digital technology, is not a given. So you need to also work on the willingness of people to actually embrace it. So basically, of course, like when we talk about Canada or United States, we of course have situations where people would very much be willing to embrace it, but they don't have the means, or it simply is not there. And that's a shame. But I think it's important to also take into account the fact that digital exclusion is more than just not having access to to the infrastructure. It's basically not being able to participate on equal terms in our digital society.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. And I wonder if part of it is the way that we term it, right? Like the Internet of Things is a really common expression for internet access and just what's available through the internet. Paolo, you've advocated instead of the Internet of Things to talk about the Internet of People. Why is that important for us in our discussion to think about the Internet of People?
Well, a couple of years before the pandemic, I started thinking, being a researcher in smart cities, algorithm, apps, and devices driven by data, there was something fundamentally wrong about all these. And it's not just about the digital divide, but it's more profound for me, it's more profound than that. It's about the goals of a digital society, what kind of society we want to build, what kind of future we want to be locked in for the next technological turn, until the next technological turn. So I started thinking about, we are going in the wrong direction towards the Internet of People, these devices that exchange data and the driverless cars and automatic services. Instead, we should go back to the origins of the Internet, the very basic, obviously with upgrading in terms of technological progress we made since the beginning of the internet, but the basic ethos of the internet, which is connecting people, being a pleasure to gain information and have some leisure time and so forth. So that's why I thought we're going towards something wrong and would like to go back to the Internet of People. And to be fair, there's been a tech backlash recently against how the internet has been structured by the huge corporations, the high-tech giants, and I'm very pleased of that. But then the pandemic has done its work on this, because absolutely before not many were recognizant of this extreme situation we are in.
Thank you very much. Madeline, I'm wondering what you think about the Internet of People. I mean, you've in many talks and in like a lot of the things that you've raised have spoken about the fact that, Nunavut has a treaty, it entered into a treaty, and there are rights that that Nunavut residents have and should have under these obligations with the federal government. And of course, many people know, including us, how the federal government has engaged with Nunavut leaders over advancing their rights. Does something like the Internet of People help draw out that information in a better way, or is that that helpful at all in what you're doing on your end?
Well, I mean, of course, the primary purpose is at this point in time for us to be connected with each other. And when people do not have access to computers or the internet, it makes it incredibly difficult for people to get information, especially during a pandemic, about sort of, are the COVID cases, what are the precautions that people should take, where were there potentially hot spots, being able to do basic things like online banking. More and more federal government, especially benefits, have to be accessed online. So there's a lot of barriers. Interestingly enough, I mean, I don't think that a lot of people need nor want, here, their refrigerator, being connected to the internet. But we are seeing things like outboard motors having computer chips on them. And, people are learning and getting quite frustrated that their outboard motor, which they use for, being able to hunt and harvest a lot for, providing food for their family, needs to be connected to the internet and needs to sort of, upgrade. And it's kind of bizarre when
Oops, I think we're seeing the internet cut out here. Completely emblematic of what's happening in the north. Not that we would hope for that to happen here, but maybe while Madeleine reconnects, Sofia, you've done some work on the human rights angle, which is, I think, where Madeleine was going in her description. Is this something where human rights law can help in achieving this internet of people that Paulo speaks about?
Well, in theory, it should be. So, so when we look at the case law that we have, and I'm not knowledgeable of the case law in Canada, but in Europe, the European Court of Human Rights has actually been asked the question whether the right to internet is, is basically is a fundamental right, human right, basically. And so far, the question has been, well, it is when it comes to to governments. Not being able to actually shut down the internet, to limit, for example, like spread of misinformation, or in the case of political oppression. So in that context, when governments try to shut down the internet, yes, the access to internet has been regarded as a human right. However, when it comes to affordability, when actually we are talking about actions that governments have to take, then it becomes more complicated, because so far, I mean, there is literature actually stating that, positing that it should be, that also access should be regarded as part of the human rights. Mm-hmm. But so far, I haven't seen, a relevant case on this. So basically, courts have not really delved into this question of affordability, which is a pity, actually. So I would say that I think it's quite honest to just and quite sensible to just say, well, right to the internet is a human right for sure. I think we see it either as part of the right to free expression. So I think that then you see that dimension, but also there are also many scholars that actually would argue that the right to internet is much more than an instrumental right, because the internet is not only the medium, it's also the expression itself. It has become more than a vehicle, and that is the part where much more work has to be done, because it's not just like an instrument. It is much more. It is something itself. So I believe there is enough case law out there already determining that it is human rights, but we need to work more on the dimension of states actually making sure that it is something that is implemented, and that is dimension of affordability, access in general, and skills. That is where this part of human rights is not working yet.
Ray and Paulo, I'm going to come back to pick up some threads on what Sofia just said, because it's directly relevant to the work that you've both been doing. But Madeleine, I want to come back to you because you're in the middle of saying something really important, and we lost you.
You lost me because my internet is not stable. It was like on cue.
Yeah, it was like a performance of the problem. Yeah.
And then I was wondering if I was ever going to get back on or how long it would take. So my apologies and it's actually beautiful out today. So I don't know even why it dropped, but nonetheless. So I was just saying that sometimes it can be really frustrating not having sort of, the ability to connect primarily for, the information and services. And that there can be equipment, as I was saying earlier, I don't know when I got cut off, where the internet is embedded in equipment. And I know that, even something as basic as, let's say, I don't know, game consoles or your computers, constantly sort of, needing to connect to the internet to download some patches, some software patches, and it just eats up your monthly data. It's exorbitant. The overages that people end up paying ends up being hundreds of dollars every month. And we're talking about a population where 70% of our Inuit households are facing poverty or food insecurity and having to make those tough choices between, needing the internet to be able to access information services or do you feed your family?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's helpful to hear all of these different dimensions of the issues too. Broadband as infrastructure, broadband as a means to participate in the economy, to participate in political participation. Paolo, I'd love your thoughts here on that aspect of the issue. Many, in recognition of the fact that there is a lack of affordability, especially in more urban areas or places where unlike Nunavut, the infrastructure is there. There are public facilities that might provide accessible internet to members of the public. Is this helpful? Like, is this the kind of direction that you think government should be going to enable civic engagement? Is this the answer, like providing it in the public sphere, or is it kind of missing the mark on the larger issues?
Well, we tried, I think, for the last 20 years to put internet in public places. And now there was also the fashionable going to work in a cafe. I think each of us has done that, the cappuccino and doing the emails, whatever. But here it's been more than that. I guess for me, it's about really understanding that, and the pandemic helped us in that. No digital society will be built without giving this basic crucial infrastructure to everyone. It'd be like water, gas. Imagine our lives without water or without electricity, without the sewage system. There is a standard that we would define for our own society as normal. So therefore, it's a matter of public intervention, and I hope we can unpack that during the conversation. There are different solutions to this, but certainly, if there isn't a political will behind this big project, I think it's very difficult to implement, and that's why the discourse on here, maybe I open a can of worms, but the discourse on human rights leaves me be cold, in the sense that there are many human rights that they're on a paper and they're difficult to implement. If there isn't no political capital, if communities cannot get organized around funding, public funding, in order to establish it and make these human rights then viable for everyone, that becomes disjointed from reality.
Yeah, I think that raises a crucial point. I'm going to come back to Sofia and Paolo to talk more about what the alternatives are, what you see in your work in other jurisdictions. But I want to come to Ray for a minute to talk about one really important initiative that you already mentioned, Ray, that ACORN had advocated for and actually had succeeded in getting, which was programs like Connecting Families. So there are a lot of one-off programs in Canada in absence of a national broadband strategy. But you've said before that it doesn't really work very well to have these one-off programs. And then I'm going to turn to Madeleine to ask about the one-off programs that exist in the North. But Ray, can you tell us about why they're not working the way that the government thinks they should?
Well, for us, for ACORN, connecting families was considered a bit of a win in 2018. It was the federal government encouraging the telecoms to offer $10 a month internet to low-income families. Now, families is a key word. To qualify, you need to be receiving the child tax benefit. That rules out all single individuals, seniors, and so on. There were 220,000 people eligible who were asked to participate, and only about 5% took them up on it. Apparently, there were all kinds of barriers. Dealing with the telecoms was difficult, and what people found when they did get the service, if it was a family with several people in the household, the speed was too slow, and people more than one person at a time couldn't really do very much. So there are limitations to that program. We have been asking the federal government to extend that program to all low-income people who are not covered by it already, and to increase the speed to basic needs. And we haven't really gotten anywhere with that, which is why I mentioned that we're looking at the possibility of municipal internet, which makes use of existing infrastructure in the cities. And in Toronto, we've had some luck with that. On Saturday, we're having an online forum to launch a campaign to try to get that in Ottawa. We're hoping to avoid some of the pitfalls that Toronto seems to be falling into, but that's another story. So with regard to what Paolo was saying, I guess what ACORN is one small example of a group of people trying to get the will, to get the public officials interested in treating this issue as a human right and doing something about it. And as I say, the key thing about connecting families was that it showed, despite protests to the contrary, the federal government can do something if it has the will to do so.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't adequate, but it was something. And we're asking them simply to do more.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to turn back to Madeleine to talk about that kind of advocacy angle and just addressing a problem that seems intractable. So some people, have said, well, the North, it's cold, there's permafrost, it's just not possible to have the solutions that advocates are seeking. But of course, we know that in many Northern jurisdictions like Iceland or Finland, there are programs that enable internet access for, almost everybody. Madeleine, can you tell us some of the war stories, like what you've experienced on the ground trying to advocate for a more holistic issue and where, like, a more holistic solution to the problem, and especially the role of telecoms, like where they fit into this picture?
Yes, thank you. So you're right in so much as that it's been very challenging to see the necessary investments and improvements to have better connectivity in Northern Canada. And that in part because we don't have a national strategy, for connecting rural remote Canada, and that there's no regional sort of sub-strategies, is that the way it works right now is that you've got these federal funds like the Universal Broadband Fund and previously the Connect Innovate Fund and the CRTC Fund, is that you have to compete for that funding. And so it pits different telecommunications companies against each other. It makes it very hard for the smaller regional or local, companies to compete with the really large ones, and especially when the large ones, for the most part, have not wanted to invest in rural remote Canada. They don't see it as profitable. They will go into rural remote Canada if they're, enticed with enough public subsidies to do that. But it does make it really hard to sort of see, adequate competition or proper planning, a proper strategy, a rollout. Often in the past, there was criteria that even shut out startups. So you had to prove that you were already in existence for 3 years. And then they said, well, this facilitates partnerships with the existing telecommunications companies. But most, people in the telecoms knows that, the large three do not partner, do not want to partner. So, again, that was another shutout. It also doesn't facilitate effectively Indigenous economic reconciliation when there's no dedicated or set aside funds or dedicated Indigenous spectrum, which we see is available in the United States and has also now begun to be recognized in Mexico. And you're right, we do see our other Arctic nations or northern countries, doing better than Northern Canada. We've got Greenland, which is right next to us, has 2 subsea fibers going into Nuuk, and then they've expanded it out. As you indicated earlier, Iceland, there's been fiber and rollouts in Alaska, as well as northern parts of Scandinavia. So we know it's possible, and that it does require all 3 levels of government, and ideally Indigenous organizations and governments, to come to the table and make a serious commitment to figuring out how do we roll out adequate internet in rural remote Canada. And reality is that on one hand, yes, it can be as a necessity like water, but also it's a massive economic booster. Wherever you improve the internet, you do see the ability of those regions and those people and those to facilitate business development. Right now, we're doing what's called a boomerang effect, where a ton of digital economy is lost because you can't develop websites here. You can't do a lot of multimedia, and it gets sent to the South, edited in the South, uploaded in the South. And what's even more bizarre is that a lot of our cultural content that we develop, in our own language, is more accessible to everyone else in the world with better connectivity than us. So there's a lot to be said on the subject, but the fact that other northern regions or Arctic nations, are making those investments and good returns on those investments, demonstrates that Canada can and should do better.
Sophia, how come it works that way in Europe? Like, I'm sure it would take much longer than all the time we have to explain the entire structure of EU, broadband strategies. But why is it that jurisdictions like Finland and Iceland have such robust approaches to this issue? Or do they? Is that just what we think, but on the ground, it's actually not as good as we hear?
No, it is very good. So Iceland and Scandinavian countries, especially Finland. So it actually should be said that Finland is actually the champion of them all, even though Finland also has extremely remote areas. I believe in Finland, 93% of the population is well connected to high-speed internet. And I mean, really high quality internet. And it is interesting because, for example, there are not only cultural activities, but there are also like modes of participation in the democracy that are actually also exercised by Finnish citizens in a way that cannot be exercised elsewhere. So, for example, in Finland, crowdsourcing legislation is very common, and everyone, regardless of where they are, will participate because they have good internet. In Iceland, the constitution was crowdsourced. Most people participate online. No one went to the city halls to actually voice their opinion because they were all well connected. So even for democracy, this is also important. So I mean, it must be said that Scandinavia has been investing for many years in infrastructure. Finland, for example, of course, has the very famous example of Nokia, tech company. So that also says a lot about how the country look at technology. But I think there are decades of investment. So the country decided to actually have a policy on developing infrastructure regardless of where it was. And it should also be said that in Europe, there is also for many sectors the obligation to provide universal access to a number of infrastructures. So internet telecommunication is one of them. So in that sense, because this is an European something that comes also from European law initially. So because of that, the combination of policies, investment policies, and also a long-standing, like regulatory framework that actually took the regulatory way in a different way that Canada and US did. This actually has helped ensure that populations in remote areas were not deprived of access. Also, the thing that has to be said is that access to the internet is also affordable in these countries. Right. So that is something that you don't have everywhere around Europe either.
Paolo, so just sort of building on that, you've worked with local areas on this question of internet access. Do you see the same kind of positive moves being made by governments?
What do you mean by local areas? Basically, the community networks we were building in London.
Yeah, exactly. Cities and communities.
Well, we didn't have support from local government. It was the early 2010. Maybe the issue was not so prominent at the time. We were building a community network in London, and it was all thanks to friends of a friend's provider, which gave us a tier 1 broadband for free. So we were getting what the state or maybe the city should own and give to the various organizations, ISPs, internet service providers, small cooperatives, which I'm really willing to incentivize in this sense. And that's how it worked. But then it worked also thanks to a lot of goodwill, voluntary work, members of the community that were more skilled than others. They were climbing rooftops, putting antennas in people's flats, on balconies, and so forth. So, but I'm not sure if I answered your question on this.
Yeah, no, it does. So that whole kind of civic engagement around the issue, do you think that was a big part of why jurisdictions had to introduce better solutions?
I think the big game changer here is being the pandemic, in the sense that a lot of people were talking, especially in academia and media studies, about the digital divide and the necessity to have a plan for the internet. But it's been really the pandemic which was a big shifter, the game changer. I spoke to some engineers recently, and they said we are overwhelmed by requests at the moment from the city. In a sense, we had to spend the first half of the meeting to try to convince city officials of the necessity of widening support to a certain area and so forth. Now they calling us. The meeting starts saying, this is a report of the city on digital divide. The situation is really bad. We need to do something about this. What are the solutions, the practical solutions? So there's been a huge shift in perception. And you see also in the US federal plan for broadband, there's been game changer altogether, and historical windfall of money in broadband, and hopefully will give some very good results.
Madeleine, do you think the federal government's announcement in Canada is that kind of catalyst? Is that the windfall that we've been waiting for?
Well, the additional $1 billion to the Universal Broadband Fund will help. You know, as I recently sort of went through the process of applying for funding, it's important to know that it's also tied to rolling out 5G primarily in the urban centers. It would have been good, I think, you know, to have separated the two funds, and that the ultimate goal of, you know, connecting rural remote Canada to 5010 is a pretty low threshold now in 2021, and definitely is going to be really low by 2026 and 2030, when we're seeing people connected with fiber in predominantly large urban centers in Canada, where, you know, we're talking about gigabits and we're talking about terabits, you know, so it's the quantity of data, it's the speed of data, it's the, you know, unlimited broadband, it's the bundling of internet and cable and phone. You ideally, you know, don't want to see the situation where the digital divide, you know, just continues to grow and grow despite, you know, some significant investments. So we need to be, this is why I strongly advocate for a strategy that is looking for, the best path or plan forward, to really realize and maximize the return on these investments, that are significant rather than tiny incremental sort of advances that we've seen. So, the last announcement that we had in our region was 49.9 million, to triple, the speeds. And that just went from 5 to 15, and 15 is just, nowhere near what the vast majority of Canadians and who are in the South, especially in the urban centers, enjoy. I mean, that's sort of speeds and data from 10 years ago.
Ray, I have a similar kind of question for you, but more focused on ACORN's activity. I mean, ACORN has really been at the helm of this issue around low-income folks being able to connect. Can you tell us more about the advocacy around that?
Well, we have done phone blitzes and rallies and marches and that kind of thing. We've had we've spoken to cabinet ministers and parliamentary assistants to cabinet ministers. They generally agree with everything that we say, and then they say, well, the government has no power to do that. The CRTC has to approve it. One of the most recent things we did, just one day before a stay-at-home order came down, we had an action over in Gatineau, which for you others is across the river from Ottawa. It's part of the National Capital Region. The CRTC is located there, and the Competition Bureau is located there. And a group of us went over to deliver letters to both of them, protesting the Rogers-Shaw merger. And in both cases, well, in one case, we had to take the letter to the door. That's as far as we could get. In the other case, we were shepherded from one security guard desk to another until we finally got sent to the mailroom, and they accepted our letter and said they would pass it on to the commissioner of the competition board, the competition bureau. I think what worked was telling the security guards that this is where the competition bureau is, and this is a working day. Why can't we drop off a letter for this individual who runs it? So ACORN is active in various ways, but with the pandemic, that limits the possibility of taking action in public. We've had a lot of meetings leading up to this campaign launch that we're talking about for this coming Saturday, where we're shifting our focus from asking the federal government for $10 a month internet, or possibly following on a precedent from the US, where there is a $50 discount for low-income people to help pay for their internet, which apparently is going to go on through the pandemic and for 6 months after the pandemic is declared over. We've been asking for those things from the federal government, not getting very far. And now in Toronto, as I've said, the city council has passed regulations to start a municipal broadband service using their own infrastructure and aiming at low-income neighborhoods first. That's good, but we understand that the city of Toronto intends to sell or to auction off this infrastructure to the telecoms to make revenue out of it, and hopefully get the telecoms to agree as part of their conditions of getting access to this, hopefully to get them to agree to offer low-cost internet for low-income people. We're going to have a speaker from Toronto Internet tell us about that coming up on Saturday. But that's our big focus right now. We've beaten our heads against the wall with the federal government for too long, and we understand from a couple of city councilors that this infrastructure exists all throughout the city, and it could be tapped into, possibly in connection with a nonprofit called National Capital Freenet, who are trying to offer low-cost internet for low-income people, and the infrastructure that the city has could be married together with Wi-Fi nodes that National Capital Freenet has. So we've been talking to them about that, and we're hoping that maybe something will come of all that. Maybe there could be some coordination of their efforts.
Paolo, do you think that there's more of a sense of infrastructure, like broadband just being another kind of infrastructure, like water or sewage, where you are? Does that help explain why there's such a different civic approach to it in Spain and in other jurisdictions in Europe?
I think people are beginning to think of it that way, but the impression I'm getting from both Sofia and Paolo is that Europe is far ahead in this direction.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from both Paolo and Sofia on that front. Like, is that just a much more given assumption as opposed to what we're seeing in North American jurisdictions, that it's just the very basic thing that needs to exist for people? Maybe Paolo, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm not sure, in the sense that, yeah, of course, I'm at the moment in Italy. The digital divide is huge, and there's a slow machine, the government machine of funding start rolling from the pandemic onwards. This green and digital society, which seems to be the buzzword of today. So I would suspend my judgment and see something happening here too. I follow a lot what's happening in the US. I'm really impressed by the plan put on by the federal government, and I hope that is the model that European countries would follow, for the simple reason that I don't see a big state monopoly like the British Telecom suggested by UK Labour before the last elections as one gateway to the public internet. I see more like a lot of funding available, and then cities, counties organizing themselves to accommodate and develop with communities a dialogue, as Ray was saying. They had a chance to speak to their own council. I don't know if the outcome of the discussion is going to be positive for them. It depends a lot from political will and political capital. But of course, one thing is to speak with the local councillor. Another thing is to pick up the phone and speak to Verizon or Virgin Media or whatever, and maybe with an offshore client customer service office somewhere.
Yeah. So just before I go to Sofia and then onwards to the Q&A, where I understand we have quite a few questions, Paolo, can you just tell us a little bit more about the digital divide where you are? Is it similar to what Ray and Madeleine describe, or does it manifest itself in a different way?
Well, I mean, my personal experience here is pretty much living in confinement as most of the population and sharing my connection with the neighbors. In Barcelona, I know that there's been a report from the city council now on digital divide, commissioned with the help of World Mobile Congress. So a very interested party in this. They did a survey of about 2,500 people, and they come out, the digital divide in Barcelona is not too bad. Also, Barcelona has got a long tradition of investments in tech industry, and like a quarter of the economy of Catalunya is on tech industry and ICT. So it depends very much, varies very much in the area where you're going. And also in Catalonia, the rural city divide was the reason through which Wi-Fi.net, the most successful and popular open access network, started to build the community-based network, took place with over 35,000 nodes now in different villages, small towns, and the rural areas of Catalonia. But the pandemic showed also that it's not just about urban versus the rural. It's digital divide is very much present also in cities. And this report I was mentioning from the city of Barcelona says still a very high percentage of pupils couldn't follow distance learning. I think it's about 25% of the people they were supposed to connect for one reason or another. So there's still a lot of work to do there too.
So maybe I'm wearing a bit of a rose-colored glasses when it comes to Europe. But Sofia, I'd love to get your thoughts on this about, I mean, it does seem like there is a difference in how much, at least some governments in European countries are willing to invest in broadband as a basic infrastructure. Do you think it's a cultural thing? Is it a legal reason? Like, why is there this different, it seems like a different perception anyway than what we see in Canada?
Well, I think there is a different economic and cultural perception of the word infrastructure in Europe than in the US and Canada. I think European countries have in general invested more in developing infrastructures in general. So, I mean, also like just transport. So, I mean, Italy might have, like some areas where there is just digital divide, but it does have probably better, train infrastructure than, for example, the US has in Canada as well. Of course, the sizes of the countries are also very, very different, obviously. But I think the investment infrastructure is very different. And since the 90s, there have, of course, been regulatory frameworks that have actually ensured that there was more attention being given to investment infrastructure, of course. But at the same time, of course, Europe still has, like 80 million citizens who have never had access to the internet. So, of course, 80 million is not a lot in Europe, but it's still, significant. And, in countries like France, 50% of the population may have a smartphone, but still they cannot really doesn't know how a computer works. So you still have that. So it's not like it's definitely better than Canada probably or the US, but still, I mean, there is much work to be done. And there is a big disparity in Europe between countries. So the Netherlands is one of the best connected countries in Europe, for example, like Finland, like Sweden. But of course, then you have Romania, for example, where there are millions of people who are totally disconnected. So in that sense, I think Europe, it is a good example in many ways, but at the same time, it's not perfect because you still have, digital divide exists, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that's an important takeaway in general from the whole discussion is that the realities of local communities. I mean, I know we need to go to the Q&A, but I have a whole bunch of more questions even about Nunavut itself and the differences between, Iqaluit and Pond-Inlet, for example, like what happens amongst different communities within the jurisdiction. So maybe Madeleine can find a way to answer that, or we'll find a way to talk about it another time if possible. But I want to just turn to the Q&A because I know we have a few questions. So Ange, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. The first question is from Maria. And Maria asks, Sofia had mentioned the many barriers to internet access. Could she or other members of the panel talk more about what some governments have done, even when broadband access is available and affordable, to successfully address other barriers, like many people's discomfort with using computers and technology?
Well, that's a great question. So, for example, Denmark has excellent infrastructure. Internet is, relatively affordable, but they were not only senior citizens, but also young citizens who were having some issues interacting with digital government, for example. So Denmark has developed digital assistance programs that allow, citizens that experience some troubles engaging with the internet to actually be assisted by someone. So there are, people that actually help citizens. The UK has also digital assistance programs as well. And in the Netherlands, there are networks of voluntary organizations. So that's not really public, but there is like a parallel system that actually ensures that citizens, especially seniors or citizens that have literacy issues, that they are assisted when filling in papers, when just getting to know how the internet works. So these are like some programs that have been created to ensure that people actually have some kind of assistance. And many schools in Europe are now creating digital literacy programs for children, so that the new generation will already be educated in using the internet.
Great, thank you. And Ange, do you want to ask another question?
Yeah, sure. The next one, I do want to remind people as well that they can use the Q&A button to ask questions at any point in time. if they'd like to. The next one is from Richard, and Richard asks, says, in the past, when Canada has recognized infrastructure that was essential for Canadians, water and electricity, it was either made available as part of a publicly owned utility or was provided through heavily regulated private utilities. Why do you think that we have largely left broadband access to a lightly regulated private sector?
Great. Who wants to tackle that one? Maybe Madeleine, do you have some thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, when our government of Canada decided to sell Bell and effectively moved away from a Crown Corporation or utility model, on the basis of trying to get the private sector to make those investments, what we've seen is that combination where spectrum is a public resource. We auction it off. Sometimes it gets used, or sometimes it gets hoarded and unused. And we're seeing, what's happening over time is the dominance of a handful of very large national telecommunications companies, making billions of dollars of profit annually, and not investing in the underserved parts of Canada. And that sometimes underserved parts of Canada are even in our urban centers where, the internet is just simply not affordable. And definitely not seeing, those, investments being made into rural, remote part of Canada without, again, further, federal government subsidy. So we definitely have a bit of a situation which is a bit of a challenge, and I've actually find myself stepping up and now being part of a telecommunications company that actually looked at the business model versus utility model, and we've gone with a utility model with a real commitment of making the internet as affordable as possible. It's not profit driven. We do need to make money to cover our costs, which is how it works, with most energy utility companies. And, I really do think that this is the appropriate model, especially when you are getting, significant federal government investments. So there needs to be a lot more transparency. I think that, the federal government, which is using taxpayers' money, can make, requirements for how that is going to result in really affordable internet. Otherwise, as I said, a lot of those big telcos, they're sitting on billions and billions and billions of dollars, primarily, directed for shareholder payout rather than for, for the benefit of serving regular Canadians with the most affordable and the best service possible.
Sofia and Paolo, do you have, can you tell us more about the regulatory side of how this works in your jurisdictions or jurisdictions that you know about that seem to do it a bit better? Maybe we'll start with Sofia.
So I can give an example of, it's not a jurisdiction where I live, but I find this quite interesting because it's actually it's very recent. So for example, Portugal has enacted a new law creating a social tariff for access to the internet. So basically, this means that people like citizens below below certain income group actually will have a very significant discount on their internet bill. And until the pandemic, it was like no one had thought of this, of course, but now because children had to attend online classes and everyone had to work remotely, then it became very clear that there were many households who did not have access. So I thought this was actually very interesting to ensure that more people actually obtain access. The affordability question came into play, and then government enacted the social tariff, which is basically a very important discount on the price of internet. I think basically it would mean that citizens would have access to the internet for 10 euros, 10 euros per month, which is probably like 12 Canadian dollars or something. So in that sense, it was quite affordable because, in Portugal, the price of it was not proportionate to the minimum wage. So that I thought was a very interesting measure.
Yeah. What about you, Paolo? Either from, where you are or the US examples that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a historical reason for the lack of investment in broadband and the internet infrastructure before it was broadband. I think it's because the internet developed really massively as a popular thing in ages of rampant neoliberalism, end of 80s, beginning of 90s. So there was not much interest governments putting money unless there was a market failure, so they won't compromise with the market, so forth. And now we're seeing the disastrous effect of this. For instance, Sofia mentioned cables. The cable company was the solution for most, so the market was responding to the needs of people for entertainment, for leisure, for television settings. So the cable company was the emblematic of this sort of thing. Not many thought about the internet as this vital, crucial infrastructure of communication as we've seen today, especially after the pandemic. So in fact, during the pandemic, Netflix had to lower the quality of transmission because the copper cable cannot cope with upload speed, especially. You would typically have 2 or 3 kids watching videos, and then your work meeting is going to be like a wheel turning around, you cannot connect. So the sort of frustration we all used to these days. And there are also technological issues, of course. And when you start building infrastructure, you got to lock in the country for years to come in a certain future. So probably the internet technology at a much higher speed than national plans. That's why I'm not so much in favor of big national plans, but more into pot of money and then different localities. In more dynamic ways, they can decide which suits them best.
Ray, is that part of the push from ACORN to have an Ottawa-based solution that, kind of the local community driving the need and the control over the infrastructure?
That's a good point. When I hear the others talking about the utility model versus the corporate model, obviously, when we're approaching the city of Ottawa to treat the internet as a utility, as something that is needed and that is not accessible to many people, that's following the utility model. That's getting away from leaving the whole field to the corporate interests. But when it comes to what governments are doing, for example, I apologize for not being specific about the Shaw-Rogers merger because some people listening won't know about that. But when we talk about billions of dollars floating around in the telecom industry, Rogers wants to use $26 billion of that to buy Shaw. And we believe that's going to cut down on competition, and that's going to drive prices up. And that's an example of what happens with the business model as opposed to the utility model, or even more government regulation, as someone was mentioning. So yes, the idea of a municipal internet is a kind of a default because we haven't been able to get very far with the federal government. But as I said, with connecting families, there's an example that they can do something if they want to, and that program could be extended. We're making other demands along with the low-cost internet for the municipal system. We're talking about free public Wi-Fi in all public spaces, including bus shelters, LRT, that's light rapid transit in Ottawa, community centers and other places, and expansions of programs that offer free or subsidized devices for low-income people. Well, now I bring that up partly to tie into my own situation. The device that I'm using right now was provided to me by my community health center, not by the government. Now, I find out with the Rogers outage the other day that it's actually Rogers that is charitably providing these devices and limited data to my health center. but they don't want people to know it because they don't want to upset their regular customers. I also am getting tutoring for, which is mainly aimed at seniors, but it's available to other people, from a voluntary organization that's run by 2 philanthropists. The government's not doing that. ACORN occasionally runs digital literacy workshops, which I haven't been able to participate in for lack of the right kind of devices. But I think the way that ACORN sees it, as far as I can tell, I'm just a member, I'm not an official. But ACORN would definitely lean on the utility model over the business model. And our action with regard to Shaw and Rogers is an example of that.
Thank you very much. And do I have time to ask another question, or do you have another question from the floor that should be asked now?
I can give you another question okay. The next one is from Ricardo. Ricardo asks, I've heard some US cities have provided universal affordable internet access to all. Do any of the panelists know if that's true? And if so, how well does it work and how did it come to happen?
Does anyone know the answer to this? I feel like maybe Paolo or Sofia, but maybe anybody here does. I don't, yeah.
Well, universal access to all, I don't think heard of it. There are different schemes, of course, and for low income as well. And now there's going to be this massive federal grant aiming to bridge the digital divide, but I'm not aware of free access to all. There are different projects depending on, for instance, New York City has done something like that in Queensbridge, the largest housing estate complex in the US, offering free connectivity as a service within the housing complex, you know, affordable housing or subsidized housing, whatever. And therefore, but there was also an issue of speed there, because at the time, 2-3 years ago, the internet speed official definition for broadband in US was 25 uploads, 25 downloads, sorry, and 3 uploads. And as you can see nowadays, this is already been replaced by the new grant asking to update the internet speed to 100 symmetrical, so 100 megabytes download, 100 megabytes uploads. Because, for instance, to do this meeting on Zoom, I'm using my uploads data rate, not just download. So we need a symmetrical way of doing it. For me, for what I heard in the debate in the field at the moment, we really should aim to 1 gigabyte, symmetrical, because this will fiber to home will save us 10 years probably of technological change. It's a time-proof technology for, I think, at least 10 years.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Before I turn to Sofia, I just want to preempt this by saying we need to have a whole nerd out session just on speed of access and, fiber optics and just the, kind of looking at the infrastructure side of it all and how that is so pivotal in this entire discussion of what it means to actually have accessible broadband. But Sofia, maybe I'll turn to you. Do you know much about this question on the US model?
I'm afraid I don't actually. I actually don't know. I'm afraid I don't. I've heard something about it, but I actually can't reply. I'm so sorry.
Okay, that's fine. We'll all be eagerly Googling after. Oh, Ray, did you?
Yeah, I'd like to make a comment.
Sure.
Ricardo's question. I've not heard of free, widely accessible internet in the States, but what we have heard of is, I believe, a federal program offering $50 discount for all low-income people. And there are other programs as well. And that program offers a $75 discount to people on tribal lands. And that was a precedent that we were talking to the federal government about, but they haven't taken us up on.
Okay, that's really helpful to know about. Madeleine, do you know anything about this, about the other models in the US?
Well, there are a number of cities that, and including even in Canada, where there's like hot spots, and so it facilitates, people being able to, connect, get their own emails and texts outside of the regular plan, so not on your carrier. So you can actually sort of go onto a city network. Something that most people, if you travel, at an airport, you're kind of used to, so you move over. The data sort of limits are usually there to sort of control costs, but it facilitates, safety, accessibility, as well as, actually it's really good for tourism. So it means that people can not have to use their own data. But again, the sort of I envision that one day that, there are, I'd love to know, we had, the concept of intranets, so where you can actually sort of have, access to the internet, just not in hotspots. I've seen people talk about sort of the need and value. The question is exactly who pays for it, and, how, so it could be, absolutely done. I think there may actually be unique models. Hong Kong used, I think, what I had heard, Moscow I'd heard. So again, a little bit more research would probably need to be done to sort of see exactly, how is it paid for? Is it, the city paying for it? And how do you distinguish that from, the businesses and the home users? Because of course, there has to be a fundamental sort of market pair for it. And then there's the whole sort of concept of, wanting to ensure that the internet is not used in nefarious ways as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the big takeaway from all of this is it's not that we don't have the ability to implement good changes. I mean, there are lots of different ideas, lots of different models, lots of ways to do it. It comes down to making sure that the political space allows it to happen, and that governments commit to it. At least that's my sense. This is not an imagination problem. This is just a practical do it kind of issue. Sorry.
I say very much so.
Yeah. Yeah. And was there another question before we conclude?
Yeah, there's a couple more questions actually.
Okay. Do you want to ask both of them, and then we'll make sure that we'll give the choose your own adventure choice to the panelists to decide.
Okay. But the first one actually is for Ray. It's from Delia, and Delia says, I'm interested in Ray's description of what ACORN is doing to get affordable internet access in Canada. How can people who share these concerns connect with ACORN and get involved in its affordable internet campaign? And the second question, which is actually for everybody, and it is, I'd like to ask each panelist if they can make one recommendation about what Canada could do to deal with our grossly inequitable internet access, and what that one recommendation would be.
That's perfect. Okay, let's start with Ray and then work our way at least across my screen to conclude.
That's an easy one to answer, actually, because I've got my notes from our last Internet for All meeting right beside me. And people can simply Google ACORN Canada to get to ACORN's website, a general website. But in particular, people in anywhere near Ottawa can go to, or can email ottawafo4@acorncanada.org. That's the person who's specifically kind of coordinating our Internet for All campaign here in Ottawa. There are other campaigns going on across the country, but I would say Google ACORN Canada and go from there if you want to look up your local city.
Excellent. Thank you, Ray. Next on my screen is Paolo. Paolo, what kind of closing words of wisdom do you have for
for all the models situation I've looked at, I think the most successful one, at least for urban broadband for all, would be a city, or maybe a coalition, a group of neighboring cities that they build their own infrastructure. Cities have hundreds or thousands of rooftops they can use to put antennas on. They have poles in the streets, so they can really layer nicely a fiber to home service, and then leave to local ISPs or local organization or startups or cooperatives or group of community activists. Then they sell their own services. So if they want to touch other services like a television, Netflix or something, it's up to them. But I think the basic service, the backbone of society should be available, be like the water infrastructure, the sewage, they should be there. And then the city will have power to negotiate affordable internet in the process, or in the procurement process, as big player there. Say, okay, you want to give internet to this neighborhood, that's fine, but you need to guarantee to me that the 15% of these people, they are on school meals and so forth, will have of internet price and so forth.
Yeah, so really centering the city as a hugely necessary actor in all of this. Sophia, what do you think?
Well, since everyone has already mentioned infrastructure and access, I would definitely say we need to also invest in skills, digital skills, educating citizens to become really digital citizens, to know how to use the internet safely. If you're sharing internet with your neighbors, please know what that means, because that is also important. I think people are not aware of that. Internet is expensive to many Canadian families. If you're sharing it, be aware of the risks. Be aware of the risks of not using internet safely, and also educating citizens, not only the young generation, but also older generations, for the perils of and potential of internet.
Hugely important point that we didn't get enough time to talk about, but thank you for that. And Madeleine, last word to you.
I mentioned it earlier, the value and the need for actually our country to really commit on doing a proper internet infrastructure and service strategy. What we have so far is there's no real understanding of how we're going to fix this. As I said, right now we've got a number of funding sources that different entities can apply for. What that usually means is that those companies that have the resources apply for the funds, they lobby the decision makers, the politicians and management in Ottawa. So I think we actually have to completely sort of commit to doing a rethink. Why and how did we get to this stage? Learn from the past and stop repeating the mistakes that just perpetuate the status quo, or entrenches large telecommunications companies dominating the country, but not actually ensuring equitable, fair, affordable access to all Canadians from coast to coast to coast.
It's a perfect way to summarize this panel. Thank you so much to Madeleine. Thank you so much to all of you for your really insightful ideas and thoughts. I'm going to turn back to Jim to give the closing remarks, but thank you all for attending as well.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to join you, Alex, in thanking the panel for a very engaging and informative conversation. Thank you so much for doing that with us today. I also want to share with the audience what is coming up. The next in our series is a very different topic. It's, does confidentiality work against justice? We're seeing in Canada and elsewhere a great increase in non-disclosure agreements that are increasingly common and increasingly controversial. They're often seen as necessary to end difficult disputes. But they prevent the public from having access to important information and can perpetuate injustice. So should non-disclosure agreements be made illegal, or will that cause more harm than good? And so we have a panel of really interesting experts on this who are going to discuss this next week, next Wednesday, a week from tomorrow, April 28th at 3 p.m. And I also would be I'm pleased to announce that the Center is starting a new series starting on May 19th, titled Taming Big Tech, Exploring the Alternatives. And our first conversation will feature Cory Doctorow. So if you want more information about any of the upcoming Center for Free Expression events, as well as podcasts of all our previous events, you can go to our website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca. So CFE for Center for Free Expression, cfe.ryerson.ca. And a video recording of today's panel discussion will be posted on our website tomorrow. So if any of you who've watched this would like to encourage others to have a look, please direct them to our website. Again, thank you to everybody, the panelists and the audience, for joining us today. Goodbye.